Well, over the last few years, the Western nations and civilization that we are all so proud of almost went completely off the rails, substituting communist-style authoritarianism and censorship, especially but not exclusively during COVID. Hidden under pseudonyms like cancel culture and diversity, equity and inclusion and unconscious bias and hate speech. The only true antidote that the common man and woman in the street has to totalitarianism is free speech. Free speech is the magical potion that liberates human beings from their overlords, from the slave masters of big tech and big government. Free speech is kryptonite to those who seek excessive control and who abuse their power. Let us never forget that this nation and this great Australian society of ours was threatened and bullied and coerced and lied to during COVID by the administrative state. A few of us, I am pleased to say, did what we could to resist with what limited tools we had. But we came through because free speech triumphed over brutality and government censorship. And it did so largely thanks to one man, Elon Musk, who bought the ultra-censorious app Twitter, fired 80% of its woke staff, all the censors and fraudulent fact-checkers, and returned it to the people to use to express themselves free of Chinese-style control and manipulation. So I was delighted to see that Elon Musk has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2025 for protecting free speech. Here is Musk talking about his fight to make X a platform for telling the truth.
One place where you can find out the truth.
Yes.
And
the only place.
yeah.
So how much pressure, to the extent you can say, has there been on you to shut it down or to censor it?
Well, I mean, apart from the multiple Democrats saying that I should go, they want to put me in jail, take away all government contracts from my companies, nationalize my companies, deport me as an illegal, and have me arrested because I'm apparently Putin's best friend. Nothing besides those things.
Free speech is demonized by all the usual suspects on the left, for whom free speech is limited basically to anything the left likes, whereas anything they disagree with is labelled misinformation or disinformation, and anyone who puts forward alternative views is a conspiracy theorist. Here's Robert Kennedy Jr. at the hearings this week for his nomination into Trump's administration to make America healthy again, explaining the problem with labelling people conspiracy theorists.
That label was applied to me because I said that the vaccines, the COVID vaccine, didn't prevent transmission and it wouldn't prevent infection. I was called a conspiracy. Now everybody admits it. I was called a conspiracy theorist because I said red dye caused cancer. And now FDA has acknowledged that and banned it.
Kennedy went on to point out, as I have many, many times, that what are today's conspiracy theories, as often as not, are tomorrow's truths and facts. Truth does not belong to government bureaucrats. It was Jacinda Ardern, the far-left socialist Prime Minister of New Zealand, who during COVID claimed that the government was not a source of the truth, but the sole source of truth. Well, that is 1984. This is fascism and it is communism.
Any time to clarify any rumour you may hear, covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth.
So I say, beware of any government that limits your right to speak and think freely. Which brings me on to these comments this week from Tanya Plibersek.
I think it would be a really good sign if Peter Dutton now made clear that he will also vote to strengthen laws against hate speech in Australia. Those laws are before our Parliament. It would be very good to see that he will be voting for those in a bipartisan way, because this is a time when the Jewish community doesn't need to see people trying to make political profit out of this, but sees our major parties in particular coming together to say all of us find this upswing in anti-Semitism horrifying and completely unacceptable.
Sorry, but this is balderdash and poppycock. The Jewish community don't need new censorship laws from stopping people saying stupid or even evil things online. What the Australian Jewish community desperately needs now and has needed for the past 16 months is political leadership that unequivocally supports Jews and condemns and marginalises those who despise Jews, especially within the Islamic communities. And how about law enforcement authorities actually do their jobs and enforce existing incitement to violence, death threat and racial discrimination laws by arresting and even deporting Jew haters from both the radical Islamic communities and Jew haters from the hard left? There should have been calls for the arrest and deportation of that vile character who was, to my mind, inciting violence by publicly celebrating the rapes and murderous butchery of October 7th on the streets of Western Sydney and the crowds doing the same on the steps of the Opera House. How is it that the same Australian law enforcement authorities that so eagerly assaulted everyday Australians for 2 years simply for not wanting to take a vaccine or not following public health orders or whatever, now seem so powerless in the face of the relentless incitement to death and threats of violence made by the activist crowds? We don't need new hate speech laws, which will almost certainly lump together anti-Semitism and Islamophobia into one neat little leftist bundle of moral equivalency. What we need are governments prepared to enforce existing laws. Governments prepared to throw those responsible for this sort of vile, disgusting graffiti right outside a Jewish kid's school into jail for a very long time. And we need politicians prepared to name and shame and condemn the unacceptable excesses of radical Islamic communities. Speaking of which, we repeatedly saw this obscenity on Australia Day, where the radical pro-Palestinian cause has fused with the activist Indigenous cause.
Joined by more causes today, leaving a city filled with protests.
From the river to the sea! Always was, always will be!
I've came to support Palestine.
This merging of Indigenous causes and Palestinian is grotesque. We first saw it flourishing during the Voice debate, and I warned how pernicious it was at the time. The only equivalence you can legitimately draw between the historical land claims of Indigenous Australians and the land of Israel is the obvious one. Much like Aborigines have called this continent home for thousands of years, so too Jews have called Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem their home for thousands of years. If Aborigines have a spiritual connection to country, well, the Jews certainly have a spiritual connection to Israel and all the land from the river to the sea. And speaking of which, can anyone please explain why in Dubai they kindly and thoughtfully celebrated our wonderful Australia Day by projecting a gigantic Australian flag onto one of their most iconic buildings, whereas here in New South Wales, the Minns Labor government felt compelled to celebrate Australia Day by projecting this flag, the Aboriginal flag, onto our most iconic building. And finally, what do you say to that? And finally, here's a modern version of Where's Wally? Just for fun and without racially stereotyping anyone, of course, see how many Indigenous Australians from remote Aboriginal lands you can count in this activist crowd.
Always was, always will be! Aboriginal land! Always was, always will be! Aboriginal land!
I know. A cynic might suggest that the majority of those First Nations protesters are in fact white, middle-class, pampered and spoiled leftist kids whose mums and dads all vote teal.
Now, you might very well think that, but of course I couldn't possibly comment.